You ever have one of those mornings where you step outside with your coffee, expecting the calm, the smell of freshly cut grass, the way the sunlight hits the leaves just right, and then, bam, you notice something's off? That was me last Wednesday. I walked out to my backyard, expecting to see my trees, my little patch of sanctuary, looking exactly how I left it the night before, and instead I saw it. Branches gone, leaves scattered, and cuts on my old oak and maple that shouldn't have been touched. And there she was, in my mind, even if not in sight. My neighbor, let's call her HOA Linda, again thinking it was perfectly fine to trim my trees without asking. For context, my name's Alex Morgan. I live in a suburban stretch just outside of Fairview, a neighborhood that prides itself on neat lawns, happy families, and a little too much obsession with landscaping. I've got a modest yard, a couple of fruit trees, and a few shade trees that have been there longer than most of the houses around. I love them. They're part of the quiet rhythm of my mornings, the gentle backdrop to coffee, books, and sometimes just staring at the clouds. But HOA Linda? She sees those trees as her personal project, a way to prove control, or maybe just a way to meddle, because it's never about the trees. It's about asserting dominance, and she's good at it. The first time it happened, I thought maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe she didn't know the property line perfectly. Maybe the trimming wasn't that bad. But then it kept happening. Every couple of weeks, I'd find leaves clipped, branches shaped like she was preparing for a magazine photo shoot, and never, not once, did anyone ask me. I tried the polite route at first. "Hey Linda, could you please check with me before trimming the trees?" I said one morning while she was just finishing up, gloves on, looking way too satisfied with herself. Her smile was all sweetness, but I could hear the condescension in her voice. "Oh Alex, I'm just helping the neighborhood look nice." Helping, right. I didn't say much, just nodded. I walked back into my yard and stared at the cuts on the branches, the new shape of my maple that I didn't choose, and I felt that rising tension, that subtle mix of frustration and disbelief. It's one thing to have your property accidentally touched. It's another to have someone repeatedly assume they can make changes without permission. And for me, that's where patience ends. Because respect isn't optional, especially when it comes to your own home and yard. Over the next few days, I found myself walking around the yard more often, checking the edges, measuring where her clippings had reached, imagining the next intrusion before it even happened. The mental checklist became a little obsession. Which tree, which branch, which part of the yard she might reshape next. And it's funny because it's not that I hate her. I've never even had a real fight with HOA Linda, but the repeated disregard, the assumption that her vision mattered more than mine, built this quiet, smoldering tension that I knew couldn't go unresolved. So I started thinking strategically. I thought about how to respond in a way that was clever, calm, and above all, legal. I didn't want to yell. I didn't want to threaten. That's not who I am. But I did want her to feel the impact of repeatedly ignoring boundaries. And the plan that formed in my head was simple, effective, and, I think, slightly delicious. If she kept pruning my trees without asking, maybe I'd return the favor, on her property value. Not directly, not illegally, but smartly. I began documenting everything, taking photos of the tree damage, noting dates, and observing how her property interacted with mine. I noticed small things, like the way the shadows from my trees helped buffer her front yard in the afternoons, or how certain angles of her landscaping would make it less appealing if certain plants were adjusted. Nothing harsh, nothing destructive, just observations. That later could inform some subtle improvements or changes I could suggest, or at least implement in ways that affected her enjoyment and perhaps perception of her property. In the meantime, every morning I'd step outside, coffee in hand, half expecting to see another branch gone, another tree shaped like someone else's idea of perfection. And every morning I'd pause, look at the yard, and think about how strange it is that conflict can be so subtle, so insidious, that it creeps into the quietest parts of your life, the parts you thought were safe. And in that pause, I realized this wasn't just about trees. It was about respect, it was about boundaries, and it was about asserting that your space, your effort, and your vision for your own property mattered just as much as anyone else's ego or sense of control. By Friday, I'd made a few preparations. Not yet full action, but groundwork. Planting a few new shrubs strategically, marking areas for subtle landscaping changes, and consulting a friend who is a local landscape designer for advice on how to maximize impact without crossing legal or ethical lines. Every step was careful, deliberate, and satisfying in a way that felt almost meditative. I could visualize HOA Linda approaching the yard next week, expecting to repeat her little ritual, only to encounter a landscape that was subtly uncooperative, organized, planned, clever, and reflecting back the very lack of consideration she'd shown to me. And in that planning, I felt a mix of anticipation and amusement. This wasn't revenge in the petty sense. It was strategy, it was patience, it was using intelligence to balance the scales. I thought about my trees, my backyard, and my morning coffees, and I realized that this quiet, suburban conflict had become a lesson in self-respect, creativity, and the subtle ways one can respond to repeated disregard without ever raising your voice or breaking a rule. That night, I sat on the porch, sipping iced tea, watching the moonlight hit my backyard and the trees I loved, thinking about the next few days. HOA Linda didn't know what was coming. She didn't know the subtle barriers, the small landscape adjustments, the changes that would make her repeated invasions inconvenient, noticeable, and mildly frustrating. And as I leaned back, smiling quietly, I felt this strange satisfaction, not just in the idea of payback, but in reclaiming control, boundaries, and the peace of mind that comes from acting thoughtfully, deliberately, and with intelligence. By the time Saturday rolled around, I was ready. The stage was set, the trees looked untouched but resilient, and the small, strategic adjustments to my yard were complete. I sipped my coffee one last time before heading out, thinking about the absurdity of suburban life, how a tree, a hedge, and repeated disregard could turn into a quiet but perfectly satisfying conflict. And I knew that whatever happened next, I had already won a kind of victory, clarity, preparation, and the knowledge that boundaries, once set and enforced cleverly, have a way of teaching lessons that words alone cannot. Saturday morning, the sun had barely crested the rooftops when I stepped out into my yard. Everything looked peaceful, the trees standing tall, the grass freshly mown, and the subtle landscaping tweaks I'd made over the past week perfectly in place. But I knew better than to trust appearances. HOA Linda had a routine, and it was only a matter of time before she tried to assert herself again, assuming the yard was hers to trim. And this time, I was ready. I had spent the previous week carefully planning my little lesson. Nothing illegal, nothing dangerous, just subtle adjustments to the property lines, hedges, and plantings that would make repeated intrusion inconvenient and noticeable. A few shrubs strategically positioned to obscure her usual path, some flower beds angled to create awkward sight lines, and tiny barriers that wouldn't hurt anyone but would demand attention. My goal wasn't to punish, it was to teach. But I won't lie, it was satisfying to imagine her confusion when she encountered the first sign that the yard was no longer a passive backdrop to her whims. By mid-morning, I saw the glint of her SUV rounding the corner. She looked exactly like she always did, confident, sunglasses perched perfectly, a clipboard in hand because, of course, she was judging something about the neighborhood today. I stood behind the small oak at the edge of my yard, watching as she rolled down the drive she'd treated like her personal shortcut for months. Her friends followed, ready for her parade of self-importance. The first adjustment she encountered was subtle. The small hedges I'd planted along the fence line created a narrow corridor she couldn't ignore. The tires nudged against gravel edges, causing her to adjust the wheel, her brow furrowing. "What the?" I heard her mutter under her breath. The friends in the back car looked confused, unsure why the path felt suddenly more complicated than it had last week. I couldn't help but smile. Grandpa would have been proud, the precision, the patience, the subtlety of it all. I leaned on the fence, sipping my iced tea, and let them make their way slowly through the yard. Every inch had been designed to communicate a single message: respect the property lines. The second car approached a small incline I'd added, gentle, almost imperceptible, but enough to force her to slow down and focus. Her SUV wobbled slightly as she maneuvered, and she muttered more words that made me laugh quietly, shaking my head at her obliviousness. Alex, my friend Mia, who had come over to observe, whispered from behind me, "This is amazing. She has no idea what she's about to learn." I nodded. There was a certain elegance in how it was unfolding. No confrontation, no shouting, just carefully placed consequences and the inevitability of realization. It reminded me that sometimes the quietest lessons are the most effective and the ones that stick. As they reached the middle section of the yard, HOA Linda encountered the flower beds I'd angled with precision. Not a single plant was harmed, but the arrangement forced her to slow down even further, navigate carefully, and acknowledge, perhaps for the first time, that the yard wasn't just a neutral space she could manipulate. She gestured toward the flowers, squinting. "Seriously, who did this?" she barked at her friends. They shrugged, nervously, realizing they hadn't planned for this level of complexity. I stood there, observing, fascinated. The subtle genius wasn't in stopping her entirely. That would have been petty, but in making her work for every inch of progress. Every slight pause, every correction, every moment of mild frustration was a reinforcement of a principle I'd long wanted to assert: respect my property, or learn the lesson the hard way. And I admit, it was satisfying in a quiet, deeply strategic way. The climax came at the final section of the property, near the edge where her SUV usually exited with confidence. I had positioned a gentle incline leading into a narrow pass bordered by low shrubs. It looked natural, like part of the landscape, but it forced her to slow to a crawl and pay attention to her wheel placement. The tires nudged gravel, the vehicle wobbled slightly, and she muttered another string of frustrated words under her breath. Her friends were now practically holding their breath, eyes wide, watching as the parade that used to be effortless became a challenge. I could hear her trying to rationalize it, blaming the road, the sun, the wind, anything but the reality that her repeated intrusion had consequences. And that, of course, was exactly the point. Grandpa would have called it poetic justice. I called it clever landscaping. Either way, it worked. The subtle obstacles I had created forced her to slow down, navigate carefully, and reflect, however subconsciously, on the respect she'd ignored for so long. What made it even better was watching her friends. They weren't mocking her now. They were quiet, uncertain, and cautious, realizing the yard was no longer a neutral backdrop, but an active participant in enforcing boundaries. Their faces said it all: confusion, mild frustration, and the dawning awareness that perhaps HOA Linda had overstepped, and it was now very obvious. I leaned on the fence, sipping iced tea, feeling that mix of amusement and satisfaction that comes from executing a plan perfectly. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't vindictive. It was clever, legal, and profoundly effective. And as I watched HOA Linda finally emerge from the narrow passage, adjusting the wheel and muttering, I realized something deeper. This wasn't just about the trees, the shrubs, or the property lines. It was about human behavior, about entitlement, about boundaries and respect, and how subtle consequences can teach lessons that anger and confrontation rarely do. Grandpa would have been proud. He had always believed in patience, observation, and action that communicates a message without unnecessary conflict. That philosophy had been at the core of what I was doing. Every inch of yard, every placement of shrub or flower bed, every subtle slope or obstacle had been designed to communicate a single principle: respect others' property, or learn in a gentle but undeniable way that boundaries matter. By the time HOA Linda finally drove away, slowed and irritated, muttering under her breath, the lesson had landed. I didn't see any apologies, and I didn't need them. The yard itself had spoken. The trees remained untouched, the flowers unharmed, and my property was fully restored to its original form, but with an added layer of protection, both subtle and effective. It was a victory, quiet but complete, and one that didn't require shouting or confrontation. As the day ended, I walked the yard slowly, inspecting the adjustments, enjoying the sunlight filtering through my trees. The mental relief was profound. Finally, a sense of control restored, and a quiet satisfaction in knowing that clever, thoughtful action can balance the scales of respect and property rights. I realized that the experience had taught me more than just dealing with HOA Linda. It was a lesson in strategy, patience, and the subtle art of influence. Later that evening, I sipped a cold drink on the porch, watching the shadows stretch across the yard. The neighborhood had returned to its normal rhythm, but there was an invisible mark left on HOA Linda and her friends: awareness. Perhaps they'd think twice next time. Perhaps they wouldn't. But the message was clear: My property, my trees, and my space were not theirs to control. And that quiet knowledge was more satisfying than any confrontation could ever have been. By Sunday morning, the yard finally felt calm. The trees were standing tall, the flower beds perfectly aligned, and the hedges I had adjusted subtly over the past week created an almost invisible barrier that reminded everyone who passed. This was my property, my space. And for once, it felt like the balance had shifted. HOA Linda had not returned to trim another branch, at least not today, and I could already see her slow down as she approached the driveway, eyes narrowing slightly, probably noticing how the yard now required thought and attention rather than a casual drive-by intrusion. I spent the morning walking through the yard, boots sinking lightly into the soft grass, noticing how the sunlight caught the branches just so, how the new arrangement subtly guided anyone approaching to move carefully, and it hit me. This wasn't about revenge. It was about boundaries, about respect, about teaching a lesson in a way that maintained dignity on both sides. The subtle obstacles, the careful positioning of plants and shrubs, and even the angles of the pathways all spoke quietly but clearly. Respect what isn't yours, or pay attention to the consequences. The mental satisfaction was immense. I realized that, for months, the stress of watching HOA Linda treat my trees like her personal project had built up. Quietly inside me, a slow burn of frustration that hadn't exploded yet. But now, seeing the plan unfold perfectly, watching the property itself communicate the lesson, I felt a strange, calm pride. This was clever, deliberate, and completely above board, yet the lesson was undeniable. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need confrontation. Nature and strategy had done the teaching for me. Later that afternoon, I watched HOA Linda walk slowly along the street bordering our properties. She didn't enter my yard, but I could see the subtle shift in her demeanor. Careful steps, thoughtful glances, maybe even a hint of respect creeping in where arrogance had once stood. I caught myself grinning quietly, not smugly, not vindicatively, but with a sense of satisfaction that justice had been delivered in the gentlest, most elegant way possible. I thought about the deeper implications, beyond just the trees and the hedges. This situation had taught me a lot about human behavior. People often act out of entitlement, ignoring boundaries, assuming the world bends to their will. And often, they need to meet consequences crafted carefully, not harsh, not illegal, not destructive, but undeniable, to learn respect. The yard had been the perfect teacher. Every subtle bump, every forced pause, every careful maneuver through the driveway was a reflection of the lessons we often need to learn in life. Pay attention, observe, respect others, and never assume your comfort comes at someone else's expense. By evening, I was on the porch, iced tea in hand, watching the golden sunlight filter through my trees. The yard looked pristine, controlled yet natural, and the peace it radiated was intoxicating. Grandpa would have approved. He always said, "Alex, boundaries are taught with patience, patience with creativity, and creativity with consequence. Never forget that." I nodded quietly, realizing how perfectly true that had been this weekend. Every minor inconvenience that HOA Linda experienced as she navigated the edges of my property was a lesson in subtlety and patience. The neighbors' subtle reactions didn't escape me either. A few walked by, giving polite nods, noticing the yard had changed slightly, but couldn't quite articulate why. They sensed, as I did, that this wasn't just landscaping. It was a statement, a quiet but firm assertion of ownership and respect. I found humor in that, too. The yard had become a teacher, a diplomat, and a guardian all in one, conveying lessons without a single argument or raised voice. And yet, even in this quiet victory, I reflected on something deeper. This wasn't just a story about trees, about trimming, or about HOA Linda's entitlement. It was a story about asserting yourself without anger, about finding clever, lawful ways to protect what matters, and about patience and foresight in everyday life. These lessons, once internalized, are far more enduring than a heated confrontation that leaves bitterness in its wake. I felt, in that moment, that the quiet intelligence of strategy had a satisfaction all its own. I thought about the potential reactions if someone watched this unfold, or if the story were told later to friends and family. They'd probably laugh at the absurdity, suburban drama over a few tree branches. But beneath the humor, There's a lesson anyone can take away. Know your boundaries. Observe the world carefully and act strategically when necessary. Sometimes the best revenge is subtle, thoughtful, and self-respecting rather than impulsive or destructive. By nightfall, the yard was still, the trees standing tall, the hedges guiding any wandering neighbor gently but firmly along their proper course. The lesson had landed, whether HOA Linda realized it fully or not. I could hear the distant sounds of the neighborhood settling into evening routines, the occasional dog bark, the faint hum of traffic far away, and it struck me. Life continues, people test limits, but preparation, strategy, and subtle enforcement can shape behavior far more effectively than confrontation alone. And this is where I leave the story for now, because the lesson is clear, the yard has spoken, and my property is fully restored, not just physically, but psychologically. HOA Linda may return, and she may attempt her little intrusions again, but now she knows. Boundaries exist, respect is not optional, and clever, lawful, and strategic action can enforce them quietly, but unmistakably. Now, I want to hear from you. What would you do if a neighbor kept trimming your trees without asking? Would you take the polite approach, the legal approach, or a more creative one like I did? Do you think my actions were clever, justified, or a little over the top? Have you ever faced entitlement in your neighborhood? And how did you respond? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Because communities work only when we respect boundaries. And sometimes learning how to respond thoughtfully is the trickiest lesson of all. Because at the end of the day, the trees are safe, the hedges are in place, and the property speaks for itself. I've learned patience, strategy, and the quiet power of asserting respect. HOA Linda learned a lesson, subtle but undeniable, and the story, like the yard itself, remains a quiet testament to boundaries, intelligence, and the sometimes absurd but always satisfying ways human behavior can be guided without raising a voice. So tell me, what would you do in this situation? Would you let them keep crossing your boundaries, or would you find a clever, strategic way to assert respect? Comment below, share your experiences, and let's talk about entitlement, property, and the subtle ways to restore balance in our neighborhoods.